All right, here we go. Good morning, everyone. Good morning, good morning. Get back to my notes here. It's good to have everyone here this morning. We're going to look at Revelation chapter 18 this morning, and I know I do this every time, but I want to back up, make sure we have a good vision of where we're going based off of where we're coming from. And so I want to use a couple slides here of our time to remind us where we're at, where we're going, because Revelation is an apocalyptic prophecy. An apocalypse is just something that is revealed to us. It does not mean end of the world. It is in this case, it's a revealing of some of the things that happen during the end times. But Revelation is this apocalyptic prophecy that is composed in the format of a letter. So if we read the first few chapters, we saw that it was a letter to the 7 churches in Asia. Now, he didn't write a single letter to each one. Yes, there was a message in each one, but he wrote Revelation then as a circular letter. They would take the whole thing and circulate it between themselves and make copies of it in this Roman province of Asia Minor. And so this letter was designed to challenge these Christians who were tempted by the luxury of the Roman Empire. Remember, where John is targeting these letters towards is the seat. It is the very place where emperor worship really took hold and became a thing. And they were the subjects of the Roman Empire were rewarded for those things. And so people were gaining power through worshiping the emperor. And so this letter is designed to challenge that status quo. And so way back in chapters 4 and 5, we see Jesus and we encounter him. We don't know it's him to start with, but then we see that he's portrayed as this strange creature. And John hears the Lion of the tribe of Judah, and he turns and he looks and he sees a slain lamb who is not dead on the ground, but standing. And this lamb, we find out through these chapters, is the one who conquers his enemies by dying for them. That's weird. Generally, we use a sword in those days to conquer the enemies. And so this lamb is the only one who's found to be able to open the scroll that we see starting in chapter 6, 7, 8, 9 through 10. He's the only one found able to open that scroll of God's purpose. He's the only one able to bring his kingdom on earth as it is in heaven. And so the opening of that scroll brings judgments of warning onto the earth. Like the plagues of Egypt were judgments of warning. And this is going to be replayed several times throughout Revelation. First we have the seals, then we have the trumpets, and then we have the bowls in chapter 16. And in between these judgments, John tells us about this multi-ethnic army of the Lamb. That, again, we hear this, we see this theme of John hearing. He says he heard the angel tell of the 144,000 from the tribe of such and such, and 12,000 from this other tribe, and all the way till we get to 12 tribes, and there's 144,000. But the problem is he turns around to look and see these people, but he sees this uncountable multitude of many ethnic groups and many different nations. And so their mission of these people who are numbered, just like the armies were numbered in the Torah, their mission is to follow the Lamb by bearing witness to God's justice and his mercy in front of these beastly nations, even if it kills them. they will conquer the beast the same way Jesus conquers his enemies, and that is by laying down their lives, just like the Lamb laid down his own life. And from then on, the story of Revelation becomes about the battle, both the earthly battle and the cosmic battle between this Lamb's army and the beastly kings and merchants and nations who surround the Lamb's people who have been sealed. And so the Lamb's army declares that everyone must repent and everyone must come out of Babylon, because Babylon is shortly going to cease to exist. They are going to fall. And so they declare that we need to fear God and give him the glory instead of giving it to Babylon. And so the army and the Lamb sing this song of victory from the New Jerusalem that we're going to see in chapter 21. And they sing the song of victory from the New Jerusalem in what John calls the eternal gospel. Turn back to chapter 14 and verse 6. And I saw another angel flying in mid-heaven, having an eternal gospel to preach to those who live on the earth, and to every tribe and every nation and every tongue. And he said with a loud voice, "Fear God and give him the glory, because the hour of his judgment has come, and worship him who has made heaven and earth and the sea and the springs of water." And another angel, a second one, followed, saying, "Fallen, fallen is Babylon the Great, she who has made all the nations drink the wine of the passion of her immorality." This eternal gospel, this angel brings, and the Lamb's army is supposed to be declaring this gospel to the people of the world. If it all sounds familiar, if these things all sound familiar, you would be correct. Because as we look at chapter 18, these promised events of judgment on Babylon are now taking place. So Revelation is this thick, rich text that is multiple layers, building on multiple layers upon multiple layers of meaning. And so 2 weeks ago, we were in chapter 16, and we saw that during the sixth bowl, that the dragon and the beasts gathered these nations to make war on God's people, right? They gathered in this place called Armageddon, or the plain of Megiddo. This is just an area in northern Israel. This is not some super special place that has some super special meaning. This is just a place in the northern part of Israel where a lot of battles were fought. And the dragon and the beast gather these people together to make war on God's people, and this is symbolized by John bringing forward an image from the book of Ezekiel, when Ezekiel fights a battle with God, when Yahweh fights a battle with Gog in the book of Ezekiel. And Gog represents the rebellious nations who have gathered before God to face his judgment. They think that they're going to face him in battle, but God just destroys them. That's where we get this field of bones, right? The dry bones. And that justice is what comes in the seventh bowl. And that's what we saw last week in chapter 17. And now in chapter 18, and the first half of 19, we see the fourth and final depiction of what we could very easily call the day of the Lord, when evil is defeated from among all of the nations once and for all. So now, each one of these last three major sections that we have left in the book, 17 through the first half of 19, and then 19 and 20, and then 21 and 22, these three sections, each one of these explores the coming of God's kingdom from a different angle. I want you to really think about that. They explore the coming of God's kingdom from different angles. From one angle, it is justice and destruction. From one angle, it is a marriage feast and a supper. From another angle, it is the New Jerusalem and the new heavens and the new earth. And so these are three different angles of looking at the same thing. That is God's kingdom coming to complete fruition. And so let's dive into the text for this morning. This morning, let's look at Revelation chapter 8 and verse 13. One of those same bowl angels, it seems, calls John, the angels that brought the bowls. There were 7 of them. Seems like one of those angels now. After these things, another angel come down from heaven, having great authority, and the earth was illuminated with its glory. This is a completely different looking angel. Angels are not described like this anywhere else in the Bible and anywhere else in Revelation. This is a different sort of angel. It has great authority. It even has some sort of glory, whether it's the angel's glory or whether it was God's glory being reflected. Anyway, this is a powerful full being. And this angel shows John this stunningly beautiful woman dressed like a queen. But this woman is drunk with the blood of the martyrs of the innocent. And she's riding this dragon beast, the same one from the signs visions that we saw earlier. Remember that the beast is a symbol of the rebellious nations, right? The dragon empowers those beasts to do these beastly things. And the person sitting on that beast is called Babylon. She is the prostitute, the great or notorious prostitute. And Revelation showed us that this was the fall of Rome John was talking about, but not just Rome and not just Babylon that hasn't existed for 500 years when John's writing this, but also all of mankind that allies themselves against God together, allies themselves together against God. And so Revelation shows us the downfall of this empire system. It shows us that this great prostitute is made desolate and naked, that she has been stripped of her power and authority, has been burned up with fire. And Babylon has fallen because of her great immoralities. For all the nations have drunk the wine. And we get these things that are repeated 3 times. The nations, the kings, and the merchants have all done these evil things to get in bed with her. And the angel here is speaking in the past tense. These things haven't happened yet, right? The angel says they haven't happened yet, but then he goes on and speaks like they have been in the past tense. This is called prophetic certainty. Like it's so certain that it's already happened in the mind of the author. So Rome has become the dwelling place of wickedness and evil. And not only has Rome become the heart of wickedness, but the nations have drunk the wine of the passion of her sexual immorality. So the nations are not innocent either because they've gotten into bed with her. They've been participants in the immorality of Rome. So the merchants of earth have prospered. They made themselves wealthy through this immorality with Rome. So God is the one who has declared this fall, and Revelation chapter 18 is now going to describe the impact and the meaning of that fall as man organizes themselves in opposition to God. And so we mentioned this in the class quite a few times. A major poetic feature of this section is what is called writing in triplicate. In this case, It's judgment in triplicates. It's repeated sets of 3 lines. And so Rome has become a home for demons, a haunt for evil spirits, and a haunt for unclean birds. Nations have drunk her wine, kings have committed adultery with her, and merchants grow rich. The voice from heaven, as we move on down, verse 6, the voice from heaven gives us order to give back to her what she was given, pay her back double, and to mix a double portion. The plagues that overtake Babylon are death, mourning, and famine. And those who listen to this prophecy as it was read, because most people were illiterate, right? So most people who listen to this, they must have they must surely have been caught up in the rhythmic excitement that these passages bring out. And that's not even including the message that's included in the message itself. So we have these key poetic themes. I passed out a paper. We talked about it during class, so I won't hit it here too much. But we have the kings, the merchants, and the nations, starting in verse 9 and 10. And it describes what the kings do. They stand afar off. These kings are under this cry of, "Woe, woe, you great city, you mighty city of Babylon, for in a single hour your judgment has come." So these kings are standing afar off. They cry, "Woe, woe," because this judgment has come suddenly. It's in a single hour. Then the merchants, starting in verse 15. There's a little second section of merchants there, but starting in verse 15, we have the merchants, and what do? They stand afar off, and they cry, "Woe, woe is the great city, because in a single hour her wealth has been laid waste." And then we get the nations, that is, in this particular section, called the shipmasters, the seafaring men, the sailors, the low people on the totem pole. All those who trade on the sea, what did they do? They stood afar off. They cried, "Woe, woe." Why? Because in a single hour, suddenly, this great nation has been laid to waste. And so you get these 3 things repeated 3 times. And so you get a triplicate inside of a triplicate. So let's ask ourselves, why is Babylon, or why is human empires, why are they judged? And they're judged because of multiple forms of idolatry and injustice. These are the 2 fundamental charges that are brought by the prophets and by Jesus and by Paul all the way through to Revelation. Idolatry and injustice. And Babylon is guilty of sins against God. They're guilty against sins against people. They're guilty of sins against the earth itself. And so Babylon promises, it demands, and it makes claims that only God is allowed to make. And it makes its own purposes. Babylon makes its own purposes divine. And then it requires us to commit absolute allegiance to those divine purposes. And I think Revelation 18 here makes it especially clear that this is about the pursuit of luxury and the neglect of the poor, first by Babylon itself, and then by its clients, its nations, its merchants, and then by its everyday citizens, the sailors. And so one inevitable result when we neglect people, human beings, is that we then see them as goods that can be traded. And we see the elimination of other people for their failure to declare absolute allegiance to our empire. We see that as a righteous thing to do. That is then leads to violence, even more violence, and war, to death and destruction, to hunger and to famine. A full 1/3 of the cereal grains here on earth are grown in Ukraine. Did you know that? I didn't know that. There is famine going on right now in Africa because of the actions of a certain empire, because they have destroyed the fields, because they have physically blocked the ships from going down there. This is how we can see these things in our own day. And the final inevitable result is the destruction of the earth by Babylon without any sort of fear of consequences. They destroy the physical earth itself. So, then there's a call for us in verse 4. It says, the call is for us to go out from Babylon, to flee from Chaldea in Isaiah, is what the call is. The call in Revelation is, come out of her, my people, lest you take part in her sins, lest you share in her plagues. Depart, depart. Go out from there, touch no unclean thing. Go out from the midst of her. Purify yourselves, Isaiah says, Isaiah 52. Flee from the midst of Babylon. Let every one save his life. Be not cut off in her punishment, Jeremiah says. And so the call of this voice from heaven is for the people of God to remove themselves from the ways and the immoralities of, in this case, Rome. Do not participate in the sinfulness of that world. Otherwise, you will share in the plagues that are coming on Rome and her empire. And for us, we could insert Rome with the United States or Russia or anybody else, any other major Roman-esque empire of today. That we need to come out of them. We need to not participate in that sinfulness of the world, because we will share in her plagues if we continue on. And so God gives us this important warning that if you act like the world and you oppress your fellow man for profit, you will be judged along with the world. So come out from the world. Separate yourselves from the Roman ways. Separate yourself from the Roman sinfulness and sins, because they have heaped their sins as high as heaven. And God has remembered those sins because they were not hidden. They were so severe that the sins not only affected Rome or Babylon, but they also carried the whole world into sinfulness, into idolatry, into paganism. And so I think we need to make a very important observation here. We have God coming up against Babylon, and John uses these terms of what seems like it's going to be a battle, especially in chapter 19 and 20. We see in chapter 16, saw on the Battle of Armageddon. We get a similar picture in chapter 19, but there's a very important observation that we need to make, is that if you read through here, there is no actual battle. That no actual battle actually takes place. And so in Revelation, there are at least 5 occasions in which preparations for this final battle are made. And the last one is in chapter 20, when we see Christ on the white horse. And he's marked with his own blood. Now, it doesn't say his own blood, nor does it say the blood of his enemies. I'm interpreting that as being his own blood, because he shows up to the battle and he's already bloody. So he's marked by his own blood. And at these battles, no actual fighting occurs. And so we learn the fate, though, of the enemies of God, and we'll talk about that more next week. But just remember, no actual battles happen. And so, there's no actual final battle in Revelation, but let's ask why. And the why is because the images of battle are supposed to suggest to us the promise and the reality of God's defeat of evil, but they were not the means of the defeat of evil. There is no literal battle because there's no literal war of the Lamb for those present at the second coming to participate in. Let me repeat that. There is no literal battle. There is no literal war for the Lamb. There's no literal war for the Lamb for those people who are present at the second coming. When Jesus comes, there's no literal war for them to join into. And the reason I've said this like 4 times is because back in the 90s, there was a famous book series and famous TV series called the Left Behind series that saw all these battles and these wars. And those things are not in the New Testament. They're not in the Bible. And so, yeah, and it caused a lot of people to stumble because there is no literal pre-second coming crusade that's going to be conducted by Christian soldiers on behalf of God. That's an important point to make because some people believe that Christian soldiers then need to set up a physical national Israel. And that's where these sorts of beliefs come into play. There's a quote I wanted to read because I thought it was really, really good. It says, in the cataclysmic battle of Revelation 19, what do the heavenly armies do? Nothing. The heavenly armies don't do anything in chapter 19. All of the actions belong to Christ. And his only weapon is the sword of his word. The sword of his mouth, which is the word of Christ, which we're told. And so what John is trying to do here in chapter 18, and in this general section of chapter 17 through 19, he's going to repeat it at least 3 times in this chapter. And he might as well have just shouted it from the rooftops that these words and these pictures are personified symbols of the military and the economic power of the Roman Empire. But John is doing more than just trying to show the evil of those things. John is combining every single Old Testament passage about the downfall of Babylon, Tyre, and Edom. And I had to double check this myself this week, but it's true. Every single passage about the downfall of those things are found here in 17 through 19. And so John is repeating that language. John is simply trying to show us how Rome is simply the newest version of the Old Testament archetype, that symbol of humanity that is rebelling against God. And Rome is just the newest version of that. And they come together, these nations come together, or people come together to form nations that exalt their own military and their own economic abilities, and they turn it into a false god. And so this isn't something that's limited to the Babylon of the past. This isn't something that's limited to some singular future nation. This is a picture of the human condition throughout history. So you see, Babylons will come and go, right? And they will come and go up to the point to where Jesus calls an end to it, to where he comes again and he finally does away with the evil, and we finally see the end point of his kingdom. And when he comes, we'll see that the slaughtered lamb fights for God, and he will act on behalf of God to rid the world of evil. And he doesn't use a sword to do it with, not a physical sword. He does it only with his own blood. and with the word of his mouth. Chapter 19 and verse 15. And from his mouth comes a sharp sword, so that with it he may smite the nations, and he will rule them with a rod of iron, and as he treads the winepress of the fierce wrath of God, the Almighty. And on his robe and on his thigh is a name written, King of Kings and Lord of Lords. So it's not with a sword in his hand that he's literally going to shed the blood of his enemies. The sword is in his mouth. And I think it's important because the integrity of the church and the integrity of our witness as we go out into the world and tell people about Christ depend on realizing that truth. That God is not using the United States to set up a Christian nation somewhere so that all people can come to the U.S. and worship at the flag. That's not what he's doing. That's not what's going on here. The war of the Lamb is not what humans have been fighting for all of these centuries, unfortunately. We have been fighting for empire and for Babylon. And what we need to do is give ourselves up to Christ. We need to give in, to say, your way is the right way, Jesus. And I will give my life over to that. And when we do that, we can join the family of God by having our sins washed away in the waters of baptism. If you need that, or if you need the prayers of the congregation, we can help you with that this morning. We'll look at chapter 19 next week. Thanks, everybody, for listening in, for those online, and everybody here in person. We'll see you next week.